Now we're going to look, if you've got a Bible, you can look it up, Ecclesiastes 4. The words will also be up on the screen. We're going to examine life and our lives. The Greek philosopher Socrates said, the unexamined life is not worth living. Sometimes when you examine your life, you wonder where you're at. Now I want to suggest 4 books for you to read. They're not quite what you might imagine. Number 1 is the Bible, which you would expect. But number 2 is there's the book of your own heart, where you're at. Number 3 is the book of nature. And number 4 is the book of humankind, what's going on amongst human beings, what happens in history. Well, Ecclesiastes is a sad book in many ways, and chapter 4 is certainly a sad book. The sky is crying, look at the tears roll down on me. That, by the way, is a line from a song by a band. If you know who this band are, I'll be so impressed. George Thorogood and the Destroyers. They're actually coming to Newcastle with ZZ Top, if you know who ZZ Top are. But I can see Tony does. They're the guys with the beard. They're long, long beards. So ZZ Top are brilliant, but George Thorogood is even better. And they've got this, they're a kind of blues rock band, and they have this thing, the sky is crying, look down on me, I'm feeling sad and lonely. And it's, the blues are because of the injustice in the world. The actual blues as we know them came out of the Mississippi Delta, and they came out of the oppression of the slaves who had to pick cotton in incredible heat and in really bad conditions. And they were, many of these slaves were Christians, they knew the Psalms, and they developed this style of music that we now know as the blues. And that whole culture actually was permeated through with the Psalms and with books like Ecclesiastes. So we're going to look at this, and we're going to consider verses 1 to 3 first of all, the tears of the oppressed. Oppression is a fact. We can see it. And Solomon saw it in 3 things, in 3 areas. Oppression and exploitation in government and in the law courts, where the powerful overcome those who are weak. And you'll notice in the song that we sang, Psalm 10, about asking God to rise up and to defend the poor. It's funny, lots of powerful people will talk about the poor, but do nothing. And a lot of the system really does exploit the poor. So I can think of many examples. I could think of examples locally, and I can think of examples in different ways. But I want to mention one example in particular, and it's from a place called Darfur, which is now in Sudan, which has experienced so much oppression, and I'd read a fair bit about it, and possibly more than 1 million people have been killed. One of the weapons of war is rape, and so many women have been raped and abused, and it's just unbelievable. Powerful people who have guns and money and so on, they come and they exploit and they sell people into slavery. There is pain and sorrow in the lives of innocent people. Another book I'm reading at the moment is called Crimes of the Cross, and it is about the scandal that hit Newcastle several years ago, not that long ago. Many of the victims are still alive when there was abuse from people who were high in the church, clergy and bishops and others. And the kids, particularly the boys, the young boys, they had no power. Nobody would listen to them. And they cried out, and there was no one. And this is what Solomon is talking about. And he's saying there's no comfort. They have no comforter. I saw the tears of the oppressed, and they have no comforter. There's no one to stand with them and no one to help them. People are reluctant to intervene. So if I go back to Darfur, the West didn't want to disrupt the situation in Sudan because they wanted peace in the south. And the Chinese wanted the oil from Sudan, and so they supplied the weapons to those who were doing the oppression, and everyone else just turned a blind eye. There was no comforter. One of the testimonies I'm reading in Crimes of the Cross is from a man who as a 10-year-old boy, probably he was described by the commission that the government set up as the worst case of abuse in Australian history. And I'm amazed he's still alive. And one of the most heartrending parts of his testimony is, I had no one to go to. I had no one to tell. My parents wouldn't listen. Nobody would listen. And that's what it's saying here. I looked at the tears of the oppressed, and they have no comforter. Power was on the side of their oppressors, and they have no comforter. And there's no solution offered. Listen to this. And I declared that the dead who had already died are happier than the living, than those who are still alive, but better than both is the one who's never been born, who has not seen the evil that is done under the sun. Now, for those of us who are Christians, we have no right to turn away from the suffering of the oppressed. The Bible emphasizes it in so many different ways. For example, the Bible argues against high interest rates because it oppresses the poor, especially. I'm not sure if this happens here, but I know in housing projects in Scotland, you would get people who would be loan sharks, and they would loan money to people who are desperate, and they would charge 1,000% interest. 1,000% per month. And if you didn't pay up, you would be in real trouble. They give you cash. And similar things happen all the time. The Bible argues against that. The Bible argues against corrupt weights. The Bible argues, it actually mentions oppressive estate agents, believe it or not, when you find it hard to get a house. The preacher feels all of this so much that he says, I'd be better off dead. And that despair is reflected in other parts of the Bible. For example, in Job chapter 3, may the day of my birth perish, and the night it was said a boy is born. That day may it turn to darkness. May God above not care about it. May no light shine upon it. May darkness and deep shadow claim it once more. May a cloud settle over it. May blackness overwhelm its light. Jeremiah 20 and verse 18, why did I ever come out of the womb to see trouble and sorrow, and to end my days in shame? I remember a man saying to me, I couldn't come to your church, Dave, because everyone's all happy and things are going so well, and life for me is just utterly miserable, and you would not understand. And I said to him, you may well be right. You're certainly not right about everyone being happy, by the way. That's a face. That's not for real. But we may not understand what you have gone through, but I tell you this, the Bible does, and Jesus does, because it's these kind of verses here. Imagine being in such despair that you curse the day of your birth. Well, that's what Solomon is talking about. And then in verses 4 to 6, now, in case you think this is going to be one set of misery after another, it is. But hang on, because I'm not going to say everything turned out all right in the end. That's not, I'm going to show you how the Bible deals. The Bible recognizes what's real. Again, the Verve in their song Bittersweet Symphony about life, he says, I can't pray, but I wish that there was someone who'd recognize the pain in me. And God recognizes that pain. And by the way, I think that's why there is a bias towards the poor in the Bible, because many people who are poor recognize that pain. They live with that pain. They can't hide it so much. But bear with me as we look at each of these things. Verses 4 to 6 is what I'm calling the motivation of envy. So Solomon goes from the law courts where there's injustice and oppression, and he goes to the marketplace. And here he was surprised because he said, I saw all this work and I saw all this achievement. And where did it come from? It came from one person's envy of another. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Fools fold their hands and ruin themselves. Better one handful with tranquility than two handfuls with toil and chasing after the wind. Okay, lots of images there. Let's explain what he's saying. He saw someone who worked hard and was envied by their companions. That's one way of understanding it, that someone prospered and got on well and people were jealous. But I think the main idea here is that envy can be a motivation to work. What do I mean by that? Solomon was keen on the idea of hard work. But in a competitive society, the motivation for work is often envy. not the desire to produce something beautiful, not the desire to help people, but rather to compete and stay ahead of the game. And in a capitalist society, we encourage that quite a lot. Now I'm not going to argue politics and all of this, but I am going to say that if we are motivated to do things by envy, so I've got to work hard because my neighbor's got a nicer mower than I have, or I've got to work hard because they've got a better car, or I've got to work hard because they're sending their kids to a better school. And Solomon says that oppression damages relationship, but so does envy, more subtly. Proverbs chapter 14, verse 30, a heart at peace gives life to the body, but envy rots the bones. The Bible talks about better the poor who are content with the little that they have than the wealthy who are always wanting more. I find it amazing that there are people who've got 2 houses and 2 cars and a swimming pool and go on foreign holidays 4 times a year and complain that Elon Musk has got more money than them. They never look at the people who have no cars and who are struggling with housing and think, well, how can I help them? It's funny, envy pushes us in many ways. Verse 4 is really saying that much of our effort stems from our envy of our neighbors. And people use the expression, keeping up with the Joneses, whatever the equivalent is here. We live in a capitalist society where the government wants to reward risk takers, those who take risks with other people's money, by the way, and competition. But as I said, what about the motivation for doing something just because it's good, because it's beautiful or helpful? Why is it that we teach our children so much, if you go to university, you need to go and train for a job that's going to pay you well? What's wrong with, for example, having artists? I know very few artists that make a living out of art, but we should be thankful for the artists and musicians as well. But not just that. When did we decide that working as a dustbin collector, I was going to say a scaffy, but I think that's a Scottish word, working as someone who just collects the rubbish was somehow worth less than someone who deals in stocks and shares? When did our society decide all of that? A motivation for work should be that we want to provide for our families, yes, but we also want to do what's beautiful, we want to do what's good, we want to help others. Covetousness, competition, and envy go together. And despite, was it Gordon Gekko in the films, greed is good. No, greed is not good. It's not good. It does so much harm. So verse 5 is the opposite of verse 4. So verse 4 says about hard work. Somebody's working really hard because they're envious. Verse 5 is saying, someone else says, no, I can't be bothered. Why should I work? Someone will pay me, the government will pay me, or whatever. And there's a refusal to engage with life and society. And here is now, there's laziness. So for example, Proverbs 6 verse 10, a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come on you like a bandit, and scarcity like an armed man. Or Proverbs 18 verse 9, one who is slack in his work is brother to one who destroys. Think about that. If you're lazy at your work, you're like somebody who goes around destroying people. Or in Proverbs 19:50, laziness brings on deep sleep, and the shiftless go hungry. It's, maybe I'll read actually one more, Proverbs 24. I think this is also I think this is very significant. And verse 30, I went past the field of a sluggard, past the vineyard of someone who has no sense. Thorns had come up everywhere. The ground was covered with weeds, and the stone wall was in ruins. I guess nowadays, by the way, somebody might say, well, that's me rewilding. No, you've just been lazy. I applied my heart to what I observed, and I learned a lesson from what I saw. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come on you like a thief, and scarcity like an armed man. I think in our culture, there's a contempt that many people have for the working class, which is absolutely appalling in biblical terms. In fact, so much so that many in our culture want to turn the working class into a kind of benefits class dependent upon. I just remember my own dad, who worked as a boilerman, and I remember when he couldn't work because of ill health, we had to persuade him. His family had to compel him to take unemployment benefit because he'd grown up in that tradition and says, no, you work for your living. I'm not just taking money. But he'd paid national insurance for 30-odd years. He was never going to get back what he'd paid. He'd earned that. But sadly, we're creating a culture where we say to people, well, the world owes you a living and you don't have to work. So some people, there's oppression, and then some people work too hard out of envy, and then other people can't be bothered. And he talks about them as people who, it's like a self-cannibalism. The words that he uses, they basically destroy themselves. The hard-working man's working for himself. The lazy man is living off others for pleasure. Is there not another way? Well, better than rivalry and envy is contentment. And that's what verse 6 means. One handful is enough. 2 handfuls is more than we can cope with. It leads to chasing after the wind, which is futile. Learning the secret of contentment is what Paul talks about in the New Testament. So that's that. That's work. And here's another kind of work. In verses 7 to 12, it's a man all alone. He now moves from the law courts to the kind of the tradies, if you like, the farmers and so on. He now moves to the person who's traveling. Here's a man who works hard, but he's all alone. He has neither son nor brother. There's no end to his toil, yet his eyes were not content with his wealth. He's got a lot of money, but then he says, why am I toiling? Who am I toiling for? I've got nobody to give this to. Why am I depriving myself of enjoyment? The idea is here of somebody who's a lonely, hard-working individual, but without companionship, without satisfaction, and ultimately who's kind of like a miser. I remember being on a plane once, and I think it must have been Continental, because it was a Continental flight magazine, and I wrote this down. I was so astonished that it had in their magazine an advert for top business people introductions, because you're too busy to meet somebody. So we'll introduce you, and we'll introduce you to people of your own kind, top business people. And I remember thinking, if I was a top business person, which I wasn't, I don't think I'd want to be married to another top business person, because we'd never see each other. I'd just be constantly traveling and maybe sending texts or whatever. There was a man all alone, he says. What a dreadful phrase. There was a man all alone. What's the point of being famous and wealthy if you have no family or friends? I think this is particularly, by the way, about friendship, verses 9 to 12 onwards. It's often used of marriage, but I don't think it is. Although you do kind of hope that if you marry somebody, they will be your best friend. But I think he's really here just talking about friendship. Loneliness has always been a problem, but it's perhaps especially so in our society. I saw a survey last week about the United Kingdom. 50 years ago, 1 in 100 people aged between 20 and 35 spent Christmas alone. This year it was 15. It's 15% spent Christmas alone. We did an outreach, a survey in North Sydney at one point. Number one problem, one of the wealthiest areas, not just in Australia, but in the world. Number one problem, loneliness. Money doesn't buy you friends. And that's what's being said here. The sitcom Neighbours, well, it's not a sitcom, it's meant to be a serious Aussie drama, sorry. Or the sitcom Friends. When Neighbours is like when good neighbours become good friends. Well, I don't know how many of you have got neighbours like that. It's wonderful if you do, by the way. That's great. It's really, really good. But how many people there was an incident very near this church where there was a woman who died, and it was 6 weeks before anyone found out that she had died, including her neighbors. It was absolutely appalling. It really scared the people around. How could anyone not know? That's loneliness. Or the sitcom Friends, I'll be there for you, as this idea of a group of friends all living together and they're all fine, but they're not really. It's quite sad. In the context of this culture where this was written, pits, coldness, and bandits face the ancient traveler. And they're all referred to here. And what he's saying is, look, two of you traveling are better than one. Why? Because if one of you falls down, the other can help him up. But pity anyone who's got no one to help them up. And if you lie down together, and that's not talking about sex, what that's talking about is in a cold country, that's how you kept one another warm. You know, it's strange, in today's culture, you'd think this was really weird, but often if a preacher would go preaching in Scotland during winter when it was very cold, and they'd be put into a room when it was very, very cold, he and his companion would often share a bed. And it's nothing to do with any sexual reasons. People go, oh, yeah, right. I mean, you couldn't do that now. But it was just, that's what he's saying here. If two lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? Two are better than one for work. And two are better than one for our walk, if you like, both physically and spiritually. Brothers, if someone is caught in a sin, Galatians chapter 6, you who are spiritual should restore him gently, but watch yourself, or you also may be tempted. Carry each other's burdens, in the way you fulfill the law of Christ. It's a dreadful thing to be alone in the work of God. And it's a dreadful thing to be alone in anything. It's a dreadful thing to feel that you've just got nobody, and nobody has you. And notice here, it goes on, notice the increase from 2 to 3. The one may be overpowered, two can defend themselves, and a cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. That picture of the cords is a beautiful picture of what real friendship is, because it's this interwovenness where people support and help one another. Strange how we live in a world about how we're all meant to be connected. And if we don't have this thing at all times, and I mean today, I'd left this in the church and I'd gone home, and I panicked. I had to come down and get it. What it would be without my phone. This is my friend. It's not my friend. But like you've got Facebook friends, you've got all these things. No, they're not your friends. They're not your friends. People send you things, I want to be your friend. Why are you ignoring me? I want to be your friend. No, you're not my friend. A friend is someone who sticks closer than a brother. I like the Australian idea of mates, that your mates look after you. But I feel that whole idea of mateship is rapidly disappearing. And it's a very, very sad thing if that indeed is the case. So that's what he's noticing, all alone. And then verses 13 to 16 talks about the fleetingness of achievement, because he now moves on to politics. And this is where he does get political. Now, it's a difficult passage to translate and understand, so I'll try and do it to the best of my ability. So what he says is, a king rises to power. He becomes complacent and foolish. Look at me, I'm great, my country is great, and so on. And then he's alone, or at least he acts on his own and does not listen to his friends who are beneath him. His place then gets taken by a young man who's climbed up the ladder of success, who's gone from rags to riches. That person, in turn, found that his popularity was fading. And the best way I can explain this is to cite Oliver Cromwell, who to me is the greatest Englishman ever. And I know there are people who don't like that, but if you know your history, you may know why. Oliver Cromwell's a very controversial character. He took the British throne away from Charles I, and he established the Commonwealth. And I'm not going to get into all the history and politics of it, but he said this to a friend. When he was in charge, he said, "Do not trust to the cheering, for those persons would shout as much as if you or I were going to be hanged." Don't trust. They're cheering you and they're applauding you. Don't you see that in terms of football crowds or even cricket crowds? Right at the test just now, which I love test cricket, and it's absolutely brilliant. And what's the boy, Constance or whatever, and everyone's, oh, it's the greatest thing ever, and you've all got to sign up and join his Facebook page or his Instagram, and it's brilliant, it's brilliant, it's brilliant. And then he got bowled out for 8 or something today, and, maybe people are not booing him yet, but he does that 3 or 4 times, they will be. They're cheering you one time, they'll boo you another time, and that's exactly what he's saying. And so what is he saying? Loneliness and isolation is part and parcel of human existence, especially for those who appear to be successful. And the younger generation do not solve the problems of the older. And here the Bible says something I'm sure you will agree with. Politics on its own is meaningless. It's just meaningless. So let me bring all this together and say, all right, all of that, what does that have to do in terms of with me? I recognize some of it. I can even identify with some of it. But how is there any hope in all of that? Mark Twain said that we are on a plodding, sad pilgrimage, the pathetic drift between the eternities. As someone else said, as Jesus quotes, let us eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Well, why not? Why not just do that if it's all so pointless? If we find oppression and injustice in the law courts, if we find envy in the workplace, if we find loneliness in our lives, and if we find insecurity, even when we're at the top of the tree, what is the point? Where will we find justice? 1 Timothy chapter 2, I urge first of all that requests, prayers, intercession, and thanksgiving be made for everyone, for kings and all those in authority, that we may live peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness. This is good and pleases God our Savior, who wants all men to be saved and to come to a knowledge of the truth. I've just read a totally fascinating book about how war has overtaken the world again, through Iran, through Russia, and through China. And this, at the end, it's got a chapter offering the solution. And you know why? It's not a solution at all, because it doesn't mention God and it doesn't mention Christ and doesn't understand what humanity's fundamental problem is. Where will I find justice? You find it in God. Where will you find contentment? Philippians chapter 4, I know what it is to be in need. I know what it is to have plenty. I've learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. How do I get out of the rat race without being lazy and useless? Well, the Apostle James, let me see if I can just find this. Sorry. James chapter 3 and verse 13. This is terrible. This is a minister who cannot find where a book in the Bible is. We're all flawed. I know it's after Hebrews, and I should be able to find Hebrews. Hang on. I have it. Do you ever play that? Did any of you, when you were in Sunday school, ever play the kind of sword drill thing, where you had to put a Bible under and someone on your arms, and then you lifted your sword, sheath your sword, draw your sword, and someone shouted out a Bible verse? First one to get it won. Oh well, I never won that. You can see why. James chapter 3 and verse 13. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in humility that comes from wisdom. Or chapter 4 verse 4. Don't you know, adulterous people, that friendship with the world means enmity against God? We get out of the rat race when we serve God and we serve Christ before everyone else, and when it's not our ambition to be number one for ourselves all the time. You see, there's a verse, Mark chapter 8, verse 36 to 37. I think we've got that up on the screen there. What good is it for a man to gain the whole world yet forfeit his soul? Or what can a man give in exchange for his soul? I can't remember how many trillions Elon Musk is worth. But I tell you this, if you're a believer, you're richer than him. You really are. And I wouldn't exchange what I've got in Christ for all the riches of the world, because they all fade. They don't take away loneliness. They don't deal with the major problems. Isn't it strange, and forgive me, Joe, for mentioning you in that, but you're always going to have plenty of work in this world. And the richer we get, the more work you're going to have. Because psychologists and psychiatrists and so on, you know, in one sense, kids have never had so much, and yet mental health is the major issue for young people. And you can understand why. Surely you can understand why. I think maybe the way I'll finish this is just simply to say this, that the greatest question here is the question of companionship and loneliness. Chapter 4 really does deal with the oppressed having no comforter, and a man without the companionship of family and friends, and a lonely king. And I think in terms of friendship and of Christ, the early church has some quite fanciful interpretations of this passage. Jerome, for example, saw in the threefold cord the faith, hope, and love of 1 Corinthians. Ambrose, as another, just an early church leader, said this: Christ is the friend who sticks closer than a brother. He is the one who lifts up the companion when he falls. He is the one who warns. He is the one who went from the prison to be a king. I think strength is gained from human relationships, and if God has blessed you with friends, and if God has blessed you with a lifetime companion, and if God has blessed you with a good family, be thankful for that. But I've been reflecting on that quite a bit, actually, because we had a really good conversation with two really good friends. I know we don't have many friends, but really good friends. And I just thought, isn't it wonderful that there are people who you can be friends with for a long, long time? You gain strength from one another. And family as well. Sometimes family can be a curse, but in general, it's usually a blessing. Strength is gained from human relationships, but the greatest relationship and friendship of all is found in Christ. If you're lonely, I can't provide you with a companion. No, I can't say, hey, look, I'll find someone you can marry, or I'll find you a best mate, or come to our church and hang around for social stuff afterwards, and that's the kind of friendship you need, because it's not really. But what I can offer you is something very simple. Christ is the friend who sticks closer than our brother. He is our reason for working. Everything we do for the Lord. And that just really, really liberates you. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. If anyone's got a question or a comment, you can text it in, or feel free to ask it. Okay, yeah. This one, I'll do this one anyway in terms of... I'll paraphrase this a little bit. So it's really saying, isn't Christianity meant to be about almost like a drug that takes you away from all this stuff? No, it's not. Drugs do that. They take you away, but they just cause more pain. Lots of things can take you away from the pain. Lots of things that you can turn your eyes away from the oppressed and the oppressors. You can ignore all that's going on in the world, but it doesn't do you any good. What Christianity does is it helps you to face up reality, and instead of becoming cynical, it gives you hope, because you realize that Jesus came into the world to save the world. Anyone else got anything?
I trust in His care.